had something they wanted to change. Marketers wanted to change consumers. Salespeople wanted to change clients. Bosses want to change employees. Leaders want to change organizations. Startups want to change industries. Nonprofits want to change the world. Some people write a book because they know a lot about it. And some of my books are like that. Other people write a book that they think there's a large audience for. And I think, if marketing teaches us anything, it's to be customer focused. The more customer focused we are, the more successful something we're doing is. If you're writing because you like writing and you want to write in a diary, that's great. But if you're writing because you want people to buy that writing, the more you think about your audience, the more effective you're going to be.
Before we jump in today, a little bit of context. This conversation is with Jonah Berger and is recorded live inside of one of our classes. Now, Jonah is the author of Contagious and The Catalyst, and he's actually one of the cleanest, clearest thinkers I know on this idea of why ideas spread, why change is hard, and what actually makes people pay attention, especially today. What made this session especially useful is that Jonah doesn't treat marketing like it's a gimmick. He treats it driven by empathy. We talk about why most authors start in the wrong place, why being original really isn't enough today, and why the best books and ideas succeed because they're built around the audience, not the ego of the creator. If you're writing something and you want people to actually read it, share it, or act upon it, this is the conversation that'll sharpen entirely how you think about this game that we're playing. Jonah is just a really, really gifted writer, but also a big thinker about pieces. He is the author of Contagious, which really talks about the ideas behind what makes ideas spread and what makes things go viral. He talks in that book at the very start about the $100 cheesesteak, which is a really cool story about a restaurant that introduced this $100 cheesesteak and why it worked and how it mattered. So that's his book Contagion, which came out a few years ago. Then The Invisible Influence was the next book. And then the recent book that came out is really an interesting take called The Catalyst. And it talks about driving change and some of those pieces. We'll talk a little bit about that in terms of driving change, especially for those of us that are trying to drive change and make ideas stick. The first one is social currency. This idea that we want things that make us look good, that make us sort of feel good about ourselves. So there's a lot of kind of ego at play and some of those pieces, which I think is really important. So how does whatever it is make someone else feel better about themselves? The second word T is triggers, and looking for these things that things that we can sort of have at the ready to tell others. Most of these ideas spread via word of mouth. So how do you actually get them to spread in that way is a big part of it. The third one is sort of this ease of emotion. He talks about being public. How do you put these things out there? How do you share and show? So if it's in the public domain that people can see it, we want to intimidate it and follow those in our own sense. Practical value. Is there something that actually sort of improves for us? It's the idea that there's sort of something that makes others better. Ben is the founder of I Can Have Cheeseburger. If you remember that sort of web platform that was just amazing at creating viral sensations. It was something really interesting to hear Ben and Scott, who is the CTO, talk about how Cheeseburger did it. And they not only built sort of the cat meme concept before memes really even became as big as they did, but they found other memes, and they found memes that would sort of spread around these pieces. The fail blog was another one they did of people who failed on video. So there's a lot of those sorts of things that certainly have played out. And I think it's powerful to sort of see just the thoughtfulness that goes into it and the understanding. That was a really big one. So we'll spend a bunch of time with Jonah talking about that aspect of how do you actually drive ideas that stick and why that's such a powerful piece.
It's like math. There is math underneath writing. I have not been able to discern it yet, but I'm convinced that it's there. And it's about detecting patterns, right? And the more you write, the more you figure out a style that works for you. Now, you have to be careful. It also has to work for the audience.
Right.
Maybe a style that works for you that doesn't work for the audience. But I think, having done this, having told stories again and again, having written academic papers again and again, you start to go, well, here's a way that works for me to explain ideas. And that helps you. So that not each time you're not coming up with new ways to do things, but you're dropping the content in an existing structure. And I think that's a good way to think about it. Think about most TV shows. Most TV shows are actually somewhat the same. They're a bunch of people. They're having some relationships. They have problems with family members and friends. Some of those shows are in hospitals. Some of them are in law firms. Some of them, so they take place in different places. They're different characters, but the underlying structure is very much the same. So I think about the same thing with writing. What's that underlying structure that helps me communicate what I'm hoping to? Before you get to the part of writing the story, to do the structure as you talked about, right? how many stories do I want? What's the point of my story? So before I go and say this is a great story, I make sure it illustrates the point I want to make in the first place. Because if it doesn't illustrate the point, it might be a great story, but it's for the wrong thing, right? And so really start by figuring out what you want stories or content to do and use structure to help you figure that out. I have a number of Word documents that are badly organized, but
Me
right.
too.
So I start with something that's like, here are some potential chapters, and here's some things in those chapters.
Yep.
And so at least I have some ideas of what the chapters might be. Now, that, by the way, requires structure. What are the chapters in the first? Before I jump into a book, I say, okay, well, do I agree with this structure of chapter? Maybe it's not the final one, but do at least I think it's the best one that I have so far? As long as I do, because once I've written a chapter, I'm going to want to stick with the structure, and I got to make sure it's a good enough structure. Then I go to the chapter and I say, well, what's in that chapter? And I start working on the structure of that chapter. And so sort of moving from bigger levels to smaller levels, but also keeping in mind the bigger levels and trying to revise the bigger levels before you get down to the smaller ones. What are the chapters going to be? If I write this chapter, but I no longer want to use that letter, what am I going to do about it? So having that interplay between the micro and the macro in terms of structure is certainly helpful. And had something they wanted to change. Marketers wanted to change consumers. Salespeople wanted to change clients. Bosses want to change employees. Leaders want to change organizations. Startups want to change industries. Nonprofits want to change the world. Some people write a book because they know a lot about it. If you're writing because you want people to buy that writing, the more you think about your audience, the more effective you're going to be. And so I was realizing, wow, there's a pervasive problem around change, that I have something to say. And so I think I have a different way to talk about change that's been talked about before. I would start with just thinking about the audience, right? Who are those people that I'm trying to change? Who are those people that I'm trying to interest? What do they need, right? Too often in startup land, people say, oh my God, I've done this thing that no one can do. It's because something hasn't been done doesn't mean it's worth doing.
Yeah.
And again, what I'm not saying is if you love something, ignore what you love. That's not what I'm saying. If you love something, that's great. But if you want to do something just because you love it, that's fine. If you want to do something because you love it and you think that it can, provide a source of income, then you need to make sure someone will pay you to do it.
Yeah.
That requires understanding and thinking about that audience. We're all egocentric, right? We all have access to our own thoughts and beliefs and opinions, and we don't have access to others.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know what you think. And so it requires more effort to figure out what you think than it does to figure out what I think. Think about writing a book a lot like doing stand-up comedy, where it works better if by the time you get to the actual show, you've practiced it a bunch, you've done dry runs, you figure out what worked, what didn't work. I started doing academic research in that space to figure out, well, why do things catch on? And in particular, in terms of why people share things, it was early 2000s. I would read the Wall Street Journal sometimes, and on page like A2, there was a list of the most read and most shared articles. I collaborated with someone who thought much more broadly than I did and said, well, why don't we scrape some of this data from the web? And so we were able to scrape thousands of newspaper articles from the New York Times, look at what made the most email list, control statistically for writing features that shape making the list. I used to teach a class that I started teaching my first year at Wharton called Contagious: How Products, Ideas, and Behaviors Catch On. And there was a day or two in the class where we talk about word of mouth. And we talked about why word of mouth mattered and what drove word of mouth. And what drove word of mouth was not very long because there wasn't a lot of research on it, but I started trying to organize it. I started trying to fill it in. People would share examples. We started talking about it. We started saying, well, what are the things? And sort of started doing almost factor analysis in my head. Things started to coalesce a little bit. I had a framework that used to be called the Aspects framework. So ASPECTS. Some students that had my class when it first came out have seen the STEPS framework and they go, what do you mean? It used to be Aspect. It's basically the same thing with a couple letters changed, one concept dropped. But it was sort of that process of iterating through sharing the ideas that led to the outcome. When you do a show or you do a bit or something, then people say, take a note. And part of what it is about being willing to listen. Because the challenge of when someone gives you feedback is, first of all, it's never as good as you want it to be. It isn't. Because you're expecting to just stand up, applaud, say, oh my God, this is amazing, this changed my life. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen as much as you'd like. But then the question is sort of, what do you do with it? And so first of all, do you listen to it? It's hard to listen to, but do you listen to it? And then do you correct based on it? And, as an academic, this happens also. I send out peer review. Most of the time they get rejected. Right now, some of that feedback is not very valuable, but some of it is. It's easy to say, well, oh, they didn't get it because they're wrong.
Yeah.
And sometimes they didn't get it because they're wrong. But if 10 people tell you they didn't get it, it's a little bit harder to say that they're wrong. And it's a little bit more likely, right, that you could do something to make it easier for those people to get. And so, people aren't going to take the time to change just because they like you. I'm trying to get to the place as a writer where I say, look, I'm going to do my best, but there's things I can't control.
Mhm.
And so, when you've done the work, some great football players said this once very nicely. What they said is, look, if you're waiting till you get to the season, it's too late. Do everything you can in the preseason, but once it gets to the season, then it's sort of out of your control.
Yeah.
And same thing here, right? Do the work, make it hard to fail. You can't control whether you fail or not, but you can make it harder to fail. And the harder it is to fail, the more likely you'll be to succeed. I couldn't sleep. I get up in the middle of the night. I have a random idea. I start sending myself, I don't know if you guys do the same thing, but when I have ideas late at night, sometimes I send myself emails that just say something with a couple
Yep.
notes. And I did that once, and I did it again, and I did it a third time. And suddenly I'm sending myself all these emails, and I'm like, I got to break open the laptop. So I break open the laptop, and I start sort of organizing an outline. It's not a great outline; it's a terrible outline,
Yeah.
but it's the beginning of what became the catalyst, right? And I knew the core idea of change is difficult. How can we create change? Removing barriers was there. The
Mhm.
individual chapters, the exact stories, none of that was there, but the
Mhm.
core idea was there. I've been working on some new research on text analysis, natural language processing. Eventually, hopefully, that will become a book. I don't know exactly how yet,
Mhm.
but maybe that will become a book one day.
My wife says to me, she's like, no more startup ideas. You got to you can't do this like a book. It's like one of these things that just becomes part of you, become obsessed with, and you're like, I got to do it. So
Yeah.
listen to yourself and find serendipity.